Good afternoon, Hornet Nation, and to our incoming special guest. My name is Robert Canada, Vice President for Inclusive Excellence, and on behalf of the Office of Equity and Inclusion, would like to welcome you to our, it seems like weekly Courageous Conversations. Today, we will be talking about honoring and centering Hispanic voices in higher education, and we are honored and privileged to have 4 scholars that will be sharing their experiences and voices. At this time, I'm going to ask Ms. Tara Piles, who's our staff liaison for Inclusive Excellence or Inclusive Communities, to introduce our guest, Ms. Piles.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Canada. Okay, first off, we have Yolani Ganel. Yolani has over 16 years of progressive experience in higher education and currently serves as the director for the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at William Patterson. She engages senior leadership and staff in the college's work to advance inclusion, retention, and student success. She has created an inclusive college campus by providing support to access and retention programs like Project CARE, committed to African American retention and education, at Western Carolina University, First Gen program at Stetson, and FYE pathways at New York Institute of Technology, to social justice retreats and gender and sexuality conference, just to name a few. She is also a founding member and leader of a grassroots LGBTQ organization in Asheville, North Carolina. Yolani is a first-generation college graduate with a master's degree in social work from the University at Buffalo, located in New York, and she is a U.S. veteran. Thank you for your service, Yolani.
Thank you.
Next, we have Angela Colon. Angela serves as the Director of Academic and First-Year Initiatives at the University of Lynchburg. He is responsible for building and fostering collaborative working relationships across campus, advocating for the needs of students in transition, overseeing all programmatic elements involving new students, providing direction and vision for the office, and promoting a positive and inclusive experience for all Hornets. Angela graduated with his Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education from the University of Connecticut, Clemson University with a Master of Education degree in Counselor Education with a focus in Student Affairs Administration, and a Master of Business Administration from the University of Lynchburg. Angelo loves all things Disney and appreciates his time as a cast member, traveling around the globe, and spending time with family and friends. Next, we have Sarah Nunez. Sarah creatively weaves her storytelling, art, and movement practice through her work, organizing, and activism, along with a passion for Latinx student and family engagement. She expertly uses healing, art, and activist modalities as avenues for creating positive, transformative, and systemic change. Some of her most valued community projects are Louisville Latinx Oral History Project, Louisville Latino Education Outreach Project, Aflorar Herb Collective, and Mi Gente. She is a nonprofit and small business consultant, lecturer, educator, and organizer with experience across several sectors. Sarah has a master's degree in public affairs from Western Carolina University, along with a bachelor's of art in interdisciplinary studies from UNC Asheville. She is currently working towards her PhD in counseling and personnel services from the University of Louisville. She was born in Bogota, Colombia, but grew up in North Carolina. Then we have Raciel Alonso. Dr. Alonso is an assistant professor of Spanish at Lynchburg and a first-generation immigrant from Cuba who was raised in Miami, Florida. Dr. Alonso's dissertation focused on everyday practices in Cuban cultural production, poetry, music, and film from the 1970s to today. His current research deals with transnational contributions of music artists like Brad Bunny and Cardi B, particularly as they relate to the political activation of youth and political activism on social media. Through his research and classes, it is his goal to inspire students and emerging Latin American Latinx scholars to center their lived experiences in cultural spaces, as well as those often overlooked or marginalized communities. He holds a BA in Spanish and an MA in Spanish American Literature from the University of Florida, as well as a PhD in Latin American Literature and Culture from the University of Kansas. And then we have Assistant Professor of Spanish here at the University of Lynchburg, Pedro Rubio, who will serve as facilitator for this conversation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Piles. Just one very small thing. It's Pedro Larrea, really. Rubio is my second last name, but I usually go with Pedro Larrea. But it's perfectly okay. Thank you. No, nothing. That's all right. So I would like to start the conversation following the same order that Ms. Piles used to introduce our guests. I wrote down that Yolani is first, then Angelo, then Sara, and then Rafael, if that's okay with you guys. So, well, being Hispanic, my first question for you all is, it has to do with how your education impacted, or it impacts your relationship with your family and relatives when you were younger, in the present, how that made a change or not.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for having me part of this discussion. And as you know from my bio, I'm first generation. I'm the first to go to college in my family. I'm the baby. I'm the baby of 3. And I come from a family that was very dysfunctional in many different ways. My mom had a 7th grade education. My father was also a middle school dropout. We lived in poverty. I'm a beneficiary of welfare. And a lot of my experience around education really stemmed from my mother's mantra of, mira, primero tu educación y después tu carrera y ya ahí tú puedes tener tu familia, right? So first your career, first your education, then your career, and then you can have a family, right? And so that's something that she drilled at a very, very young age because of her experience as a teen parent, living in poverty, being unemployed for much of her life, and also migrating from Dominican Republic to New York City at a very young age. And so I recall one of my earliest recollections of mommy talking about the significance of my education, because I also went to schools where my counselors and teachers would say things like that I wasn't smart enough, that I had to be part of an ESL program in order to be successful. And my mom really fought that in kindergarten. She said, no, my daughter knows how to read, she knows her numbers, she needs to go to a regular class. And so I started my education in that pre-K experience with my mom really fighting for us not to be placed in ESL. And to this day, I don't know what's wrong with ESL. I think that's a great program. It's a resource that we promote. But for my mom being from Dominican Republic and the stigmas at the time, this being in the 80s, of what it meant to be in ESL as someone who was an immigrant, right, meant something to her. And so that was that first experience of challenging higher education and really trying to make sense of whether or not her children were intelligent or capable. In high school, I had counselors and teachers that would say things about me not being able to be successful, and we would have meetings with my parent about my intelligence. And so it was a huge surprise to a lot of folks when my GPA in college would place me on the dean's list, right? I had a 3.18 GPA in college without even trying, right? But a lot of that work in terms of understanding my competence and my abilities were really centered around my mom's mantra. And also knowing that there was a lot of stigma and inherent things about the way I looked and where I came from when people understood that I was a beneficiary of welfare, and they knew my mom's story. There was a lot of perceptions, or I guess misconceptions about what I was capable of achieving at that age. So that's been my impact growing up. The latest one that I had from mommy was a few years ago, right? And so I just came from a trip, and we were in the airport, and mommy says, and I'm just talking about the trip, and mommy says, oh, Jolani, you sound like a white girl. And I almost died, right? Because all this time of talking about how important it is to go to school and how important it is to center yourself around career, for my mom to make that statement to me was really offensive, And I remember leaning forward like this, right? Leaning forward in the back seat and be like, "Mommy, what you mean to say is I sound educated?" And then I leaned back and she goes, "Oh, see, I'm sorry, mija. That's what I meant to say. I didn't know that that was what I should have said, but that's what I should have said." And I think these narratives of who our families are and how we show up make a difference. But I wanted you to hear my mom's voice as I shared my experience and my relationship with my family, and especially being in a single parent household. So I'll stop there and look forward to other responses.
That's a really tough act to follow, Jelani. So no impressions from me. I think that I may be a little unique in that I grew up and was born in the U.S. here. My biological father is from Puerto Rico, from New York City, also not unsurprising for the Northeast. And I grew up bilingual, speaking both English and Spanish, primarily Spanish, up until I started school because mis abuelos did not allow English in their house. So we needed to know Spanish. My parents were divorced right as I started school, and for educational purposes, and similar probably Jelani in that not understanding ESL in any way, and being bilingual, we stopped speaking Spanish because it was easier in school to do English and to speak English all the time. And so I actually lost my Spanish skills over the years by not hearing it or interacting or engaging with it very much. And in the Puerto Rican community, particularly where I grew up, that also stripped you of your identity as Latino. And so I grew up very much in a white environment. My mom pounding education. She worked 3 jobs. She had her full-time job and 2 part-time jobs to keep a roof over our head and food in our stomachs. And always, you will get educated. You must be educated. You can get us out of this situation through education. And so very much grew up in that. While I'm the second child, so I'm the middle, I was the first to graduate high school. I was forced to go to a college preparatory school. I say forced because I wanted to go there, but then after the first week, didn't want to be there because I was being confronted with an identity that I wasn't fully embracing at that time and didn't understand. So I was labeled as Latino right off the bat, in a predominantly white, all-male, high wealth high school, and was there on scholarship and was confronted with that on a daily basis and really struggled with my identity and who I was, and trying to figure out how that plays into my education. And I remember one of my classmates my second year saying, "We only have minority students on this campus because we need it for statistical purposes and to make us look good. They're less than us. They don't do as well as us." And I had snapped at that point and said, "I am completely offended by that statement. I'm actually number 2 in the class right now with my GPA. And where do you fall with your GPA? And I work twice as hard as any of you because I'm here on a full scholarship. And so I feel that I have to prove on a daily basis that I belong here." And so really it was in high school that I started confronting who my identity was and who I am as a person. Because I was being labeled it every day and grew up in a city where that was not part of our vernacular. You were just accepted who you were. Although in the Puerto Rican community, they kept laughing and saying, "You're not Latino because you don't speak Spanish." And so also wrestling with what does that mean with my education? So I studied Spanish in high school, right? And was like, I'm gonna learn this language. I have to know my language. I'm being told I'm not Latino because I don't speak Spanish. And the more years that I had it, the more of it that came back to me, and was able to communicate more effectively. Right, and so my education really helped me start to develop who I was as a Latino, and what does that mean to me. And in terms of my relationship with my family, I think it took some time for my mom to start to understand that I was not ignoring the upbringing or the family connections there, but I had a whole nother side to me that I never really knew about and understood and wanted to explore. And so I got involved in Aspira as a high school student, and learning more about my own culture, learning more about what it meant to be Latino and what that meant in my educational pursuits, going on to college, taking courses in Puerto Rican and Latino studies, did not continue my Spanish language learning in college, but was constantly around the PERLAC, the Puerto Rican Latin American Cultural Center at the University of Connecticut, was a huge identity of who I was as a college student and who I became as a person and as a professional down the road. I think I began to internalize a lot of the differences between my family and myself with my education, being first generation as well at college, and started noticing internally some differences between how I was interacting with people around me and how I was perceiving the world and how my family was. And I think even to this day, I still kind of hyper internalize things at times. And I'm like, but I'm not really the same as I was growing up. And it's because I have all this education behind me and that I continue to do. My family considers me the perpetual student because I work at a college. They don't understand that I'm not a student right now, but and so certainly it's impacted in terms of like, well, where are you going to school next? And it's like, no, I'm not going to school. I'm going to work today. And so that's been kind of my impact between with my education and my relationship with my family and my relatives. I've never actually interacted with my Puerto Rican family since my parents got divorced. So it's been a very long time. I haven't seen my father in 37 years and haven't seen my grandparents in that amount of time. And so there's been a lot. The education for me has really impacted in terms of me learning who I am and what it means to be Latino. And you don't have to speak Spanish to be Latino. Y'all can come taste my arroz con gandules. I know how to cook. So, and so really that's how it's impacted my relationship with my family, is helping me to discover who I am and what my identities are and what does it mean to be Latino, and also what does it mean in my family to have this education. I'm the only one of my siblings to have a college education and advance onto graduate degrees, and so at times I do internalize that and saying I am a little bit different because I do have this education that you don't have. But we're not better than or less than each other. We just chose a different path in our lives, and recognizing and celebrating those things.
Angelo, Yolani, thank you. What great stories. Honored to be here with you all today. Thanks for having me. I think about this question, and I like both Yolani and Angelo, so many questions or answers and things are just running through my head. But generally, I would say that, growing up, like Yolani, we lived in a lot of poverty, and we also had a lot of generational traumas kind of like attached to the family. So we had mental health issues, substance abuse issues, lots of poverty. And so, it impacted me because in essence, my family life wasn't really stable. So I dropped out of high school at the age of 16. I finished my sophomore year and I never went back. But I was determined to finish my education. So I went on, got my GED, went on and got my associate's degree, went on to the 4-year, and then got my master's. And along the way, figured out, right, how to pretty much hustle to get what the goods, right, to get what I needed to get done. So it wasn't as if my family was super supportive. They just couldn't provide me with like the car or like the bunny or like paying the insurance or I don't know, the things that parents do. And it's funny because even today, I'm currently a caretaker for both of my parents who are chronically ill. And in a time of COVID, and they actually live right next door to me, I'm trying to create like this more of a communal space so that, generationally we can support and take care of one another in a way that actually the state and the government just can't do. And I'm starting to learn that more and more every day that, it's like really what are the ways that we do succeed by supporting one another in community. And so, as a PhD student, currently I'm 41, and as a caretaker, which is been a role that I've had most of my life for both of my parents. You know, it's they're supportive, like emotionally, they're down for it. I will be the first doctor in both sides of my family when I get this PhD. I am, you know, was born in Bogota, Colombia, but raised in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I'm a Southerner. I say y'all a lot. Like, I really enjoy being in the South and being situated in a place where it's still super confusing what Latinidad even is and what Latinos are and how we're emerging as a new culture, right? And like this convergence of also like we've been stripped from so many parts of who we are, be that language, culture, dance, traditional remedies, healing remedies, right? Like we've been stripped a lot of where we come from and what our stories are. So it's a really big journey of remembering that and being able to provide that for the next generations. So generally, I think family's super supportive. They love, they want to see me succeed. But it's a struggle because I'm regularly having to show up also with pretty big family roles. You know, and I never lived on a college campus or got to experience what it was like to be in a dorm or be on a full ride or do like any of the sort of like, I don't even know if it's normal college going things, traditional student experiences. So my role in higher ed as an educator, and I'm a full-time student now, which is the first time I've ever had the opportunity to be a full-time student and really focus on my studies and, you know, do all the things I've always wanted to do when it comes to education and being like a student, outside of living on campus, because I don't think living in a dorm room would suit my lifestyle at this point in my life. But being able to have this opportunity to be a full-time student now and sort of, you know, juggle these different roles, and also, you know, live out my dreams is just it's exciting and invigorating, and I'm really thankful and grateful to be in this place. It does take a lot of extra work though, because of maybe access or barriers to being able to get right the fellowships and the different things that are needed to be able to actually support yourself as a full-time student. So still working on those parts, but thank you.
Okay. What great stories already in this discussion. I feel like this is going to be a really special talk. As Tara said, I was born in Cuba, in Havana, actually, and my parents immigrated to the U.S. when I was 10 years old, and we lived in Miami since the very beginning. So in terms of the impact of education on my family, I mean, I was really fortunate to grow up in a family where both my parents were professionals. In Cuba, my dad was a doctor and my mom was a pharmacist. So, you know, they always really put a strong focus on education. They always told me that education was, you know, my passport to my dreams. And, you know, they really emphasized doing well in school. And, you know, if I needed any help with my homeworks, they were always there. They were very encouraging and proud of my academic achievements. So I was really, really lucky to grow up in a home like that. And when we moved over to the US, my parents really sacrificed their careers for my sister and I. And that was, I mean, I remember even then, even when I was, you know, maybe like 12 or 13 years old, thinking, you know, how much they had sacrificed to bring us to a better life. And I remember that thinking that, you know, there was pressure, you know, for me to realize my dreams was in a way for them, for their sacrifice to not have been made in vain. So I felt that pressure of like, I need to succeed for my parents. And so that, you know, everything they did to get to this country was worth it. And so, yeah, so I did feel that pressure, even though I think it was, you know, truly a gift to have parents that were supportive in education. There was a lot of attention paid to how well I was doing in school. And sometimes that's not always the most positive thing, because you know, there's always doubts and there's always things that you're not great at. And, you know, my parents wanted me to be in the sciences. I was always pretty good at math and science, even though now I'm a language and culture teacher. So they always, you know, I think I settled on engineering at some point during high school. And so that's what I started studying when I got to the University of Florida. But that was not my jam, definitely. I realized within a couple of years that that wasn't going to be a viable career path for me. So I ended up, experimenting and taking a bunch of classes, and I landed on a Spanish literature class that really showed me what I could do with that. And I also remember that I really, at that point, like late high school, early college, I was really focusing or really trying to focus on maintaining my heritage, because for the first like 6 or 7 years that I was here, it was all about assimilation, like learning English and fitting in with people. And in Miami, even though Miami is a predominantly Hispanic community, and there's people from all over the world there, even there, like I remember being called a ref, which is a refugee. That's the word that they use for people who had recently come into the country and who had an accent. So I remember having a very strong desire to mitigate my accent and to sound as native as possible when I spoke English. Eventually, I got over that, and I realized that it was a great way of standing out in a room. And I feel very comfortable in this lovely Miami accent that you're hearing today. So yeah, I think that because my parents were so were intellectuals on their own, they wanted to like transmit that love of being a professional to me, and I think they did that very successfully. I did feel a little bit like there was this whole creative artistic side that I had that was sort of like pushed to the side because they wanted me to have the right career. Like my dad always wanted a doctor, he has 4 children, right? And he always wanted one of them to be a doctor. And he got one, it just wasn't specific enough because I'm a doctor of philosophy, not of medicine. I tried to please them in ways that also spoke to me and not just to their dreams, right? So I think that yeah, that was one of the challenges that I had to like rediscover that creative artistic side when I was in college. And I feel like I wish that it would have been encouraged more. I currently have a niece who is like a fantastic artist, and from like the moment she was like 5, I was like buying her color sets, and just like trying to, I'm like, this is the same thing is not going to happen to you. I am going to make sure that you can express yourself. It's a small pet peeve. But yeah, the other way that I think my education impacted my relationships with my family, because I mean they're all very supportive and very proud of the things that I have done, is that being in lit or like dealing with literal or literary criticism taught me to think in a very critical way about a lot of things that are like hot topics in conversations with your family, like politics and race and religion. And so my family has always been pretty progressive, but I think I went like way off the spectrum on the progressive side for them. My thinking evolved a lot while I was doing these critical readings. So sometimes our worldviews don't necessarily align the way they used to, and that's fine because I mean, I chose to be an educator, so it's definitely something that I carry over to my personal life and with my family. So I always try to educate them, but sometimes I'm successful. It depends. It depends on what. It depends on what. It's just if you haven't, I think if you haven't experienced the things that some of us have experienced and read the things that we have read, it's hard to really understand the nuances of why systemic racism is something that we have to combat every day. So especially in Latin American cultures where race has been so imbricated in our way of being, our everyday life, that sometimes microaggressions are just invisible because nobody really realizes that they're microaggressions. They don't even understand the concept of microaggression. So that has been tough at times but I take it as an opportunity to tell them, like, okay, so like this is what I've read and this is what I know. And you can choose, whether to really internalize that or not, but I'm gonna at least make my case. And then the last thing, I mean, I think I talked a little bit about it, was that always feeling like I had to hold on to my Cuban heritage because I felt like it was slipping in a way. I mean, I didn't return to Cuba for 17 years. So it was something that I always had like in the back of my mind. I think part of the reason why I studied in Spanish was to preserve my language. And then it just, it became sort of my raison d'etre, like my way of being, my modus operandi. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for your story. It's always fascinating to hear anybody's story. When I ask some people about themselves and I say, tell me your story, there are people who say, oh no, my story is boring. And I always think there's not a single person's story that is boring at all. So let's keep going. The second question I want to pose is, as an immigrant, what were the most shocking impressions and experiences that you had during your education that disagree or contrast with with your place of origin? And also, did being an immigrant carry any advantage over nationals or not?
So, I will defer to this question. My mom is an immigrant from Dominican Republic, and my father's from Puerto Rico, and I was born here in the States. And I'd like to maybe contribute later on in the conversation around, as a child of an immigrant, what I saw that responds to this question. So I'll defer maybe towards the end.
Yolani, if you want to answer to that question, okay, that is perfect. That's perfectly fine. It's your time.
All right. Well, then in that case, I got something to say. So, just to give some quick context, my mom is Dominican. She is bicultural, meaning she's Dominican Black, right? Her mama is identified as Black from Dominican Republic, and her father identified as white Dominican. And if you're from the islands, the way that we understand colorism in different countries, it persists and exists in Dominican Republic. And also there's a lot of issues around anti-Blackness in Dominican Republic that has carried over when my mom came from Dominican Republic to New York. And so to give some context, my mom was, because of her lineage, and this was in the 50s when she was born, she was born as high yellow, right? And they felt that because of her appearance, that she would fare better off with being raised by a white family, right? By another Dominican family that was white. And so for my mom, that had caused a lot of harm, right? It had caused a lot of harm in her understanding of her own Blackness and growing up. And even today, mommy always says, I'm Black. And even though when we are having the conversations across Latino community and Latinx communities around Blackness, and there's this kind of issues on colorism, that's a different conversation. We won't go there, but I needed to drop a pin. But my point there is that this anti-Blackness that my mom experienced in Dominican Republic, being raised by an adoptive parent that presents white, who then immigrated to America, worked in factories in New York. My grandmother was surprised, Mira, she was surprised that as a white woman, right, in Dominican Republic, that she would be treated less than by Americans when she came to America, right? Because what she didn't realize is that she's not white, right? You're Black, you're Dominican, and that was a big cultural shift for her. And part of my growing up was dealing with bigotry in the household. We had 5 people in the family, right? So it's my mom, my sister, myself, my brother, and my grandmother. That's my unit growing up. And to the point of interrogating as a child, hearing all these like racist sentiments, bigotry, I remember looking at myself and saying to my grandma, because I understood, for me, I was Afro-Latina. I knew that I wasn't white, and I knew that I wasn't Black, like Black American, but I was still Black, because that's how my mom talked to us about our identity, being from Dominican Republic. And I remember looking at myself and looking at my grandmother and saying, Abuela, are you saying that I'm ugly? Yo soy fea. And she goes, no, mija, you're not. And this is, I'm translating in English. She goes, no, you're not ugly. You're Indian. And I said, Grandma, what does that mean? And I remember when we think about strategies for confronting bigotry and that balancing that with self-preservation, well, my mom taught us at that moment, right? We went home, right? We walked home, and she goes, mira, Yolani, nosotras somos negros. We're Black. And abuela, grandma, she is from a very old way of thinking. And I always want you to be proud of who you are. I want you to always know that we are a beautiful people, and that your friends, I want you to always have friends and know that they're beautiful people too. And so my mom would have that conversation with us, but she would never say anything to my grandma. So as I grew up as a teenager, confronting that with my grandmother, the strategy there would be, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, Grandma, because I have friends and they are good people, right? And we have these conversations now in higher ed about how do we confront bigotry. And what we don't talk about is how hard it is, in that it's an ongoing process, and that there is things that we lose, right? And we try to balance that respect with our families, especially if they're providing support, but it's so important to do. And that's not just with the Dominican family, that's also the bigotry and anti-Blackness that existed in Puerto Rico. And being rejected from my father's Puerto Rican family because they were also presenting white as Puerto Ricans that present white. And again, we don't always talk about that. And we don't talk about, we don't open those conversations because they're very uncomfortable. And I recall having to confront bigotry with my own father as a teenager when I was dating someone who was African-American, and he said, be careful with people like that. And I'm like, people like that? I was like, what you mean people like that? I was like, people who are educated, who treat me well, who take me out, like, what are you talking about? And he goes, oh no, because, and then he went on to give these examples of how people like that treat women. And I said, oh, the way you treat my mom, the way you beat her, the way you dragged her across the street, the way you hurt her, like that, because that's what you did, and you're Puerto Rican. And so that, having those tough conversations with your family, having to then self-authenticate your Afro-Caribbean identity in spaces where you walk in and people don't know that has been part of my experience as a Latinx person. And especially as someone who's doing this work around diversity and inclusion, right? Because we're not always received in the way that we intend or want to be. And so I want to thank y'all for hearing that, and we can do a part 2 of that conversation another day. But
I will defer on this question. Being of Puerto Rican descent, I think many in the US forget that Puerto Rico, we've been citizens for like 100 years. So it's just a matter of did we grow up on the mainland or on the island? So I will defer on this question completely.
Yeah, I think so. As an immigrant, I always like to define it as almost like a 1.5 generation immigrant. It's even more complex for myself because my mother's got European descent, my father's Colombian, but I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and brought to the States when I was about 3 years old. So it's not like I'm really, like I'm not really an immigrant. And because also both of my parents, my father's an immigrant, and my mother's just 3rd generation, right? Her people, immigrated here in the early 1900s from Czechoslovakia and from Germany. And so I think mostly for me in the South, it was being in, so maybe as a 1.5 generation immigrant, if that's even like, sometimes I think when I think about what stage of immigrant I am, I think I go back and forth depending on, but maybe as a Latina in the United States, or as a multi-race, multicultural woman, queer woman in the US, living in the New South, right? In the Nuevo Sur might be a better sort of descriptor. I think in the South, I was in the 80s and 90s, I was one of the only Latinas in space, like in my school, in my neighborhood, and also like in the church. So I was in predominantly white spaces all the time. And the question wouldn't be like, oh, where are you from? Or tell me more about your culture or whatever. People would always just assume like, oh, y'all must be Jewish, or what's up with the curly hair, or why is your skin that color? But wouldn't always like ask the direct question, which I would much rather like engage in conversations around directness than sort of this, back end feeling microaggression stuff that over years just, kind of compiled. That of course, when I went into the professional world, sometimes those questions would be, harder to unpack because there was so much piled on from childhood. So mostly it was just a lot about, being in predominantly white spaces and being able to still like claim who and what I am. And then at whatever point I realized that I was moving closer to whiteness because of assimilation and acculturation, whenever I realized that, like in my 20s, I was like, whoop, skirt, I'm going to go over here to try to like re-identify who I am and relearn all the things I needed to learn about my culture and people on both ends, right? Both the European descendant stuff as well as the Colombian stuff. So, yeah.
All right. So yeah, I was in academic spaces, for a long time that were not necessarily predominantly white, because both the program at the University of Florida and at the University of Kansas were large enough so that it attracted a lot of international students, and a lot of like Cuban American or Colombian American or Latinx students as well, and they had professors that were from Latin America. So I never really felt like I was completely out of place. There was always people there that to support me and to guide me and to help me understand difficult situations. But I did have a couple of shocking experiences. I remember one of the most I think funny ones was, I remember being in sort of an semi-informal meeting with a bunch of professors, and when I was a graduate student, and I told somebody that I had been born in Cuba, and they were like, oh, so what part of Mexico is Cuba in? And like they were totally serious. This wasn't a joke. So I mean, at that point, I was really young and I didn't really know how to handle that kind of situation. So I sort of like laughed it off and I said, oh, it's in the Caribbean part, and we sort of put that point aside. But in retrospect, I wish that I would have perhaps been more willing to like make this a teachable moment, because it was, I was shocked. I guess I didn't know how to react in that sense. I also remember when I was a graduate student at the University of Kansas, that several departments so the TAs all had offices in one area, and there was TAs from Italian and French and other languages. And so we got reported because we were too loud, right? And that's one of the things that I feel like it's very cultural. There was a lot of Latin American students, and we were all, being ourselves because we felt comfortable. And I will admit, I can't speak for all Latinos, but Cuban culture is really loud. We are boisterous, flamboyant people. We like loud colors and loud music, and just in our daily interactions, we're loud. So like all of us sort of immediately realized that this was a cultural issue. And so we told our department, like like we concernedly try to keep it down, and but we felt like that it had been something that was that was underscoring the fact that we were different from them, culturally speaking. So I think the department backed us up, and like there was a mutual understanding behind doors with the French department that they that we would try to keep it down, but at the same time that it was racially insensitive for them to say that we were just distracting and keeping them from their work, because it wasn't that bad. Like it could have been worse. If it had been in like in the Caribbean, it could have been a lot worse. So like things like that, little things like that underscore to me sometimes that there was a certain way that you could be and there was a certain way that would be disruptive to others. And so like that, I think that that's the battle of anyone who is an immigrant, is how much do you assimilate to not only further your own goals, but to have access to spaces that could be denied to you if you don't follow the rules, or if you don't fall in line, you know. And as a relatively new faculty, there's still that pressure, I think, to sort of like put on a persona when you step into the university, and, you know, take on this really professional, almost clinical veneer, which is not a bad thing. I mean, I think professors should be professional, of course, but sometimes I feel like it takes a while for me to like really warm up to someone so that I can really be myself around them and not fear that they're going to feel offended by my personality or my culture or whatever, because it has happened before. So it puts you on alert, you know, and sometimes you walk on eggshells when you shouldn't. And I think that another example that I think is funny is greetings. So greeting in the Hispanic world or in the Latin American world are very warm, right? Especially when it's between two women or between a man and a woman, you know, like you greet somebody with a handshake and a kiss. And I remember when I first got to graduate school, I tried to greet somebody in that way, and they were just recoiled from me because they were so shocked by the fact that I was invading their personal space to give them a kiss when they had just met me. So I had to definitely pack that in when I moved to Kansas, because, you know, being in the Midwest, they're very nice people, but they're very formal people. So I had to tone that down a little bit. And I think, you know, there's probably a couple of more experiences like that where I felt like I had to sort of contain myself for the benefit of others. And sometimes it's hard to unpack yourself after all of that. And in terms of the advantage, there definitely was an advantage for me as a language and culture graduate student and professor. The perception, I'm told, is that people who are native speakers tend to be perceived as better professors of languages, or students are more receptive to them. So it did work, you know, I mean, it did work as an advantage because I could talk very fluidly about my culture, and there's a kind of, not authority, but authenticity behind the things that I say, because I am a member of that community, right? So I think that was definitely something that benefited me while I was in grad school and while finding a job. I think that a lot of the times universities can't obviously say like, we're looking for somebody who is a native speaker, but that is the quality of your language and your access to cultural knowledge and spaces can be an advantage on the job market for this particular profession. I don't think that that's the case for most Hispanic people or Latino people. Yeah.
Pedro, may I jump in right quick? So for the sake of time, and I should have known better to try to carve out 5 questions, right, to ask in an hour based off of the dialogue we're having. So Pedro, if you don't mind, if you can just ask one more question, then possibly leave time for Q&A, that'll be great.
Of course. So let's see, we have 8 minutes left, right? Okay, so we're for, let's say 2 minutes, like in a presidential debate, but I promise I won't have, it's obvious that I won't have to be saying Mr. President all the time. So let's do 2 minutes for this question, and then maybe another 2 minutes for questions. So I'll be fast. As a child of immigrants, were there any customs or familial expectations that informed your understanding about gender roles and or sexuality?
Absolutely. You know, I'm from a single parent household raised by a strong Dominican woman who had an array of expertise and wisdom on survival. I would say we learned how to be resourceful. I was a translator, a builder. I assembled everything. I was an electrician. I cooked. I cleaned. I went to court. I did everything as a mini adult as a child and leaning into adulthood. And so one of the things that as I think about those familiar expectations and gender roles, that that sense of assertiveness and confidence and knowing that I can walk a space has then created some barriers in higher education, right? Because then now I'm too confident, and how dare I make other people uncomfortable as a 5'5" woman, you know, from who's Latina and you know, come from this very colorful background. And I'm like, no, I'm confident because I come prepared. And that level of preparation came from that upbringing. And so I'll defer my time for someone else.
Again, since it's evolving immigrants and I don't identify in that way, I will pass to others. So I defer my 2 minutes, Pedro.
Sarah?
I'd say, yeah, like I think, of course, I think our Colombian side of the family, the matriarchs were powerful businesswomen who got stuff done and did it a lot of times, you know, in partnership with men who, you know, expected the women to do all of those things and maybe didn't help around the house or help with the raising of the children. And in Colombia specifically, our families came, we had, you know, people that worked in the home that helped take care of the families because they, you know, were wealthy and well-to-do in Colombia. You know, not so much the case when I was growing up, but I think that there were these, you know, norms put on the family around the role of the women and, you know, how that role played out. And especially, I think, in this sort of assimilated immigrant experience as well, all that stuff translated. So it's really generational. You know, I plan to break those cycles and be sure that, you know, in the family that I create and families that I'm creating in the future and the communities that I'm building, right, that we work really hard at breaking down those stereotypes and roles. So, yeah. Guess you get all the time here.
Okay, so yeah, definitely. I mean, I can't disagree with any of the things that have been said. Obviously, in Cuban culture, just like in, I would say, most, if not all, of Latin American culture, strong gender roles are the norm. And in my regard, I mean, my father always tried to, and all my male models always, you know, had this hyper masculinity that needed to sort of be exuded all the time. And I mean, as I discovered myself and I was forming my identity, I realized that I wasn't a lot of those things, or those things didn't come natural to me. So I definitely broke the mold in my family. I mean, for example, I carried on my mother's culinary tradition because I'm the one that likes to cook. My sister doesn't like cooking. So things like that. I think that those roles are always interpreted through every family's experience. And I do believe that today, the Latin American and Latinx communities are evolving their thinking on LGBTQ people and issues, especially the younger generations, like, you know, like just the younger generation in general in the world. But I think that as we are more visible in media, as we are more visible in everyday life, I think that it's getting better. But you know, there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think that's that every day that we are out there and we are being our true selves and we are modeling for others, for younger people, that you know, you can be Latino and queer and all these other things and still be successful and still be somebody who achieves what they want and is hardworking. I think every day that we do that, we are helping, you know, we're putting our little grain of sand to make sure that those perceptions evolve and change.
Oh, I love to add on to what Estelle said in terms of sexuality. I can tell you that sexuality was not a conversation that we had in our home, right? Because it was assumed that we're all heterosexual and that we're all cisgendered. And it wasn't until much later as an adult that that I've had some type of language around sexuality. Because sexuality being identified as a queer Latina woman, and there was no imagery or that suggested that Latino people were queer or gay or lesbian. I didn't see that growing up. And so it's really cool from what I said was saying is the representation matters, right? And doing this work now in higher ed and being out in the community so that folks don't understand who I am and those identities that I hold. But again, a lot of that means having to self-authenticate and having to be out and having to navigate spaces in ways that other Latino or Latinx people maybe don't have to think about, right, because of those privileges. So I'm glad we had that 1 minute to add that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 2 minutes for a couple of questions. If anybody wants to ask our guests.
I have a question.
Please, Daniel.
Hey, well, first of all, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed hearing all of your experiences and stories. My name is Daniel. I'm a faculty and program director for the Counselor Ed program here. So a couple counseling connections. And Angela, I didn't realize you had a background in counseling as well. So, but my question stems from something, Raciel, you talked about, but I think was embedded in some other experiences. And it's the idea of that I hadn't really considered before around professionalism and how culturally informed that is, particularly at primarily white institutions. And so I guess I'm just curious how do we change that? Like, what is the change process of that particular part of this kind of, formed idea and kind of easily seen boundaries around what professionalism is in academia? How do we stretch those to be more inclusive for everybody? So that's my question.
Are we going in order or do we pop up? How do you want to respond?
Go ahead.
Daniel, do you have any specific guess you're asking or just in general?
Just in general. I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts.
Let's follow the order. Let's follow the order then. Mm-hmm.
I would say, for me, again, I'm going to be 40 and I look good. Look at this. You see, I'm young. And so people think I'm 22, 25, and I take it, right? But what that means for me, that's also in terms of the barriers that we experience in higher ed is ageism. And a lot of this has to do with creating a workplace excellence program with HR and maybe within your own department that can speak to unconscious bias, right? And I think that ageism is part of that. So people know my experience, they know what I'm capable of doing, they see my resume, but then something about the way I look, something about the stature of my body informs people somehow like this, that I'm not smart or capable or intelligent. So I have to address that with, like Raciel said, with identity politics and wearing a suit every time, or always questioning and making sure I'm balancing my audience. And so that's one strategy in terms of unconscious bias training in the workplace would be one great way.
I'd add that I think those employee resource groups are really helpful. So like your, Latinx and or queer-based, identity ERGs are really great spaces for your faculty and staff, right, to form connections. But I think the other piece that, Latinos are really good at is building community and this like sense of family. And so I think that universities need to start to do better at actually valuing those aspects. And so if in the research, right, and in the community engagement that your faculty or your staff do, they're really valuing that work, right, as a form of the performance evaluation. And then also, of course, getting your staff, right, your staff in your faculty and in your student affairs offices to be Latinx, multicultural, bilingual, right, and people that come from our communities is so important as well, so that not just the students and the families have a place, but when you have new faculty or new staff, right, there's people right there that they can connect to that might have some institutional knowledge to share and pass on. So the onboarding experience, I think, is super essential in all of these pieces. But it's like creating an ecosystem, right? You have to have like really deep roots and really make it part of the culture.
And then Daniel, what comes to mind for me as someone who's, you're in a role of preparing the next generation of professionals, right, in the counseling field. And so inviting those those graduate students into our employee resource groups, right, and making them feel part of that and seeing what it's like to be a part of that environment, and reminding them, of course, of the unconscious bias, but also those overtly biased things. It's so common for people to get my name wrong, right? It's Colin, Colonna. They start adding letters to it. I've been called Carlos. I don't even know where that comes from, right? And so recognizing like names are really important. I am Angelo Luis Colon Jr. My name is very important in my community and who my identity is, and who I am within my family. And so recognizing some of those overtly things, right? So initially everybody's like, oh, Angelo, you're Italian. I'm like, well, actually I'm named after my Puerto Rican father, but I do also happen to have Italian background in me too, but that's not my primary identity. So also recognizing some of those simple things too, that can be very overtly biased.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that was said by Yolani, Sara, and Angelo. I guess what I would have to add to that is that a lot of the times when, people want to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, a lot of the time the focus goes directly to the minority faculty. And so I think that engaging non-minority faculty in these pursuits more is really what we need. I think if you put all the burden on the faculty of color to educate everybody else, then that can be difficult as well for those faculty that you're trying to to support, right? So I think finding a way, I think perception is changed by experience. So finding a way to foster experiences between minority faculty and majority faculty, I think that is the way forward, because it teaches people, to lose whatever fear or whatever preconceptions they have of those people. When they get to interact with them, when they get to really see who they are, I think that all of that can drop away. And I think that is a lot more effective than all the online trainings in the world. Of course, we are living in a very special moment in history, so that's not exactly viable right now. But I think that creating spaces where those experiences can happen, events where that can happen in a more organic way rather than us presenting ourselves to people, I think that is a lot more enriching, and I think that is bound to change more minds than just like a presentational modality.
Thank you very much. Dr. Canada?
Thank you all. Yolani and Sarah, this is definitely going to be a part 2, right? It has to be. And so, Sarah, definitely extend my gratitude to Ricardo for connecting me with you, and then you connecting me with Yolani, and Angelo and Raciel. Thank you all for just being great colleagues, right? Tara, thank you for that. And so on behalf of OEI, again, thank you all for attending this session on honoring and centering Hispanic voices in higher education. And again, look out for part 2, all right? So thank you all.